A corrupt CEO steals charity funds for the poor. Minutes later, the FBI storms his office. Victor Mallory, CEO of Hope for Tomorrow, stood tall in his opulent office, a slight smirk playing on his lips as he gazed down at the piles of money neatly stacked before him. Each bundle, bound with rubber bands, represented the generous donations that had been meant for the poor. Yet, in this moment, they served a different purpose, his purpose. Victor was a man of power and influence. His name was synonymous with philanthropy, and his charity was heralded as one of the largest and most successful in the world. Hope for Tomorrow had become a symbol of hope for the underprivileged, its mission to provide aid to orphanages, schools, and hospitals in the poorest communities across the globe. But beneath this well-crafted facade of benevolence, a darker truth lurked. For years, Victor had been siphoning off charity funds into his own offshore accounts, funneling millions of dollars into luxurious homes, private jets, and other indulgences that were far removed from the humble lives the donations were meant to improve. To the public eye, he was a saint. To the people who worked under him, he was a vision of success. But behind closed doors, he was a master manipulator, calculating, cold, and utterly consumed by greed. He looked down at the money before him, the stacks like silent trophies of his deceit. The soft hum of the office was interrupted by the faint sound of footsteps approaching. Victor's trusted assistant, Carla, entered the room, her face impassive as always. "Mr. Mallory, the donors are waiting for you in the conference room," she said, her tone neutral. Victor looked up at her, a hint of satisfaction in his eyes. "Let them wait a little longer," he replied, his voice smooth and composed. "I have other matters to attend to." Carla hesitated for a brief moment before nodding and turning to leave. Victor, however, remained seated, running his fingers through the stack of bills as though savoring the victory that he had so carefully orchestrated. The charity he had built, the empire he had forged, all based on the false promise of goodwill. But deep down, he knew that sooner or later, someone would begin to ask questions. The thought barely fazed him. He was untouchable, after all. The public adored him, the media lauded him, and no one would ever suspect that the man who claimed to be their savior was, in fact, their greatest betrayer. The door clicked shut behind Carla, and Victor finally rose from his desk. He grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair, adjusting it with the air of a man who had mastered his surroundings. He walked toward the door, his eyes scanning the room one last time. It was a grand space, decorated with expensive furniture and artwork, a testament to the wealth he had amassed. As he made his way to the conference room, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Everything he had was a result of his own genius, his ability to charm and manipulate his way to the top. Meanwhile, in the finance department of Hope for Tomorrow, Lena Anderson sat at her desk, a thick folder of financial reports in front of her. She had worked at the charity for 5 years, slowly moving up the ranks from an entry-level assistant to her current position as an accounts manager. Lena had always believed in the cause. She had always been proud of the work the charity did for the less fortunate. But recently, she had begun to notice something unsettling. The numbers didn't add up. At first, it had been small discrepancies, missed invoices, unexpected expenses that never seemed to be explained. But as Lena dug deeper into the charity's financial records, she started to notice patterns that couldn't be ignored. Large sums of money were vanishing without explanation. It wasn't just one or two mistakes, it was a series of transfers, each one more questionable than the last. Funds meant for orphans, for hospitals, for schools, they were all slipping through the cracks. The more Lena looked, the more she realized the full extent of the corruption. And it didn't take long for her to reach a terrifying conclusion. The money wasn't disappearing by accident. It was being taken by someone who had access to the charity's accounts, someone with the power to move vast sums of money without raising suspicion. Victor Mallory. Lena's heart sank as she pieced the evidence together. She had always admired him, even looked up to him. But now, she saw him for what he truly was, a fraud. The charity she had worked for, the one she had believed in, was nothing more than a front for his criminal enterprise. Lena's breath quickened as she stared at the numbers in front of her. She had spent hours analyzing the data, cross-referencing bank statements, and tracking the money's movements. There was no denying it, Victor was stealing from the very people he claimed to help. A million thoughts raced through her mind. What should she do with this information? Could she go to the authorities? Could she risk exposing the truth, knowing what it could mean for her career? She had worked so hard to get to where she was, and this revelation threatened to tear everything down. Lena ran a hand through her hair, trying to steady herself. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was almost time for the monthly board meeting, where Victor would stand before the donors and present his latest achievements. He would charm them with his smooth words, his perfect smile, all while continuing to funnel their donations into his pockets. Lena knew she couldn't let that happen. She stood up from her desk, the financial reports still open in front of her. The evidence was clear, irrefutable. Victor had to be stopped. The question was, how? Lena paced the length of her small office, her mind racing. She couldn't afford to hesitate. Every second she spent worrying only gave Victor more time to cover his tracks. The evidence she had gathered was damning, but what good was it if it never saw the light of day? She knew that once she exposed the corruption, there would be no turning back. Her career, her reputation, everything she had worked for, could be destroyed in an instant. Taking a deep breath, Lena made her decision. She couldn't stand idly by while Victor lined his pockets with money meant for the people who needed it the most. The poor, the sick, the children, they had trusted Hope for Tomorrow, and it was her responsibility to make sure they weren't betrayed. Lena turned toward her desk and grabbed the folder containing the financial reports. She carefully took out the pages that detailed the suspicious transfers and offshore accounts, each one meticulously logged and verified. It was all there, the proof that Victor Mallory had been stealing from the charity, using the money for his own luxury. She wasn't sure what to do next. Should she go straight to the board of directors? Or maybe the media? The FBI? Each option carried its own risks, and each one felt like a monumental decision. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that time was running out. If she didn't act now, Victor would get away with it, and the charity's reputation, everything the organization had worked for, would be irreparably damaged. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. It was a text message from Carla, the assistant who had helped Victor manage the charity's schedule and public image. The message read, "Victor is about to give his monthly update to the donors in the conference room. You should be there to present the financials." Lena's stomach twisted. She had planned to attend the meeting, but now it felt wrong. How could she sit there, knowing what she knew, while Victor continued to deceive everyone around him? She couldn't let him get away with it, not this time. With newfound resolve, Lena made her way to the conference room. As she walked down the hallway, the wall seemed to close in on her. The weight of her decision pressed down, but she knew she had no choice. She couldn't let this corruption go unchecked. When she entered the conference room, the usual faces greeted her, board members, donors, and executives all gathered around the polished wooden table, waiting for Victor to begin his speech. The room buzzed with quiet conversation, but the moment Victor entered, all eyes turned toward him. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, his confident smile lighting up the room. "Good afternoon, everyone," Victor said smoothly, his voice calm and reassuring. "I'm so glad you could all join us today. I have some exciting updates to share with you about the progress we've made over the past month." Lena felt a wave of disgust wash over her. How could he stand there, so composed, knowing what he had done? How could he smile at these people, who had trusted him, while stealing from them? Victor continued, outlining the charity's supposed achievements: new schools built, medical supplies distributed, and orphanages provided with funding. As he spoke, Lena's mind wandered. She couldn't focus on his words. Instead, she was consumed by the thought of what she needed to do. Lena's fingers twitched with the urge to pull out her phone and call the authorities, but something held her back. The last thing she wanted was to cause a scene in front of everyone. She had to be careful, precise. She couldn't risk alerting Victor to her plans just yet. The meeting dragged on, with Victor's words flowing smoothly and effortlessly, convincing everyone in the room of his integrity. But Lena saw through the facade. Every statistic, every success he presented was a lie. The money that should have gone to those in need was instead being funneled into his own hands. It sickened her. After what seemed like an eternity, the meeting finally came to a close. The donors were eager to shake hands with Victor and express their gratitude for the amazing work he had done. As the room began to empty, Lena slipped out quietly, her mind still spinning with the weight of her decision. She knew she couldn't wait any longer. The time to act was now. Lena returned to her office and sat down at her desk, staring at the pile of documents in front of her. The evidence was irrefutable. She had the proof that Victor Mallory was a fraud, and now she had to decide how to expose him. Should she contact the media? Or go directly to the authorities? Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone and dialed a number she had kept hidden in her contacts list for months, the number of an old friend who worked for the FBI. The phone rang twice before a voice answered on the other end. "Agent Harris," the voice said. Lena's throat tightened, but she pushed the words out. "I need your help," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have evidence that the CEO of a charity is embezzling funds. I can't do this alone." There was a long pause on the other end. Lena could practically hear Agent Harris considering her words. Finally, he spoke again. "Send me everything you have. We'll take it from here." The relief that washed over Lena was immediate, but it was quickly replaced by a growing sense of dread. She had made her choice, and there was no going back now. Her career was on the line, but more importantly, the lives of those who depended on the charity's funds were at stake. As she gathered the evidence and sent it over to Agent Harris, Lena couldn't help but feel a sense of justice beginning to take root. The corruption that had taken hold of Hope for Tomorrow was finally about to be exposed. And no matter the consequences, she was ready to see it through. Lena sat in the dim light of her office. The only sound in the room was the quiet hum of the computer monitor in front of her. She had sent the evidence to Agent Harris, and now all she could do was wait. The next few hours felt like days. Every minute that passed felt like a lifetime, and with each second, the weight of her decision seemed to grow heavier. There was no turning back now. The truth was out there, and Victor Mallory's carefully constructed empire of lies was about to come crashing down. But as Lena sat there, staring at the screen, she couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in her gut. What if the FBI didn't act in time? What if Victor had already covered his tracks too well? Or worse, what if he found out she was the one who had exposed him? Her phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her from her thoughts. She quickly reached for it, her heart racing. It was an encrypted message from Agent Harris. "We've got it. We're moving in now." Lena exhaled in relief. The weight that had been pressing on her chest seemed to lift, but the tension in her body remained. She quickly gathered her things and headed for the elevator. There was nothing more she could do now but wait for the fallout. As the elevator descended, Lena tried to prepare herself for the inevitable chaos. She could already imagine the headlines: "Corrupt CEO of charity steals funds meant for the poor." The public's shock would be palpable, but it was the donors and the employees who had trusted Victor that would suffer the most. They would feel betrayed, just as she had. But Lena knew there was no other way. The moment she stepped out of the building and into the crowded streets, she felt an odd sense of detachment. The usual hustle and bustle of the city seemed distant, as if she were in a different world. People hurried past her, going about their lives, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. She didn't know what the next few days would hold for her, but she knew one thing for sure: nothing would ever be the same again. Meanwhile, in Victor Mallory's office, the scene had shifted dramatically. The once pristine space, filled with luxury and comfort, now felt like a ticking time bomb. Victor had been in meetings all day, his mind preoccupied with his latest schemes. He had no idea that Lena had already sent the evidence to the FBI, that his time was quickly running out. Victor was seated at his desk, talking to one of his associates on the phone, his voice smooth and confident. "Everything's under control," he said, a smirk playing on his lips. "The media loves me. They're eating up every word I say. No one will believe a few disgruntled employees over me. I've got it all covered." As he spoke, the door to his office suddenly opened. Carla, his assistant, entered without knocking, her face pale, her eyes wide with alarm. "Mr. Mallory, there's something you need to see," she said, her voice trembling. Victor's smirk faltered, and he set the phone down, his attention fully on Carla now. "What is it?" he asked, his voice suddenly colder. Carla handed him a piece of paper, and as Victor glanced at it, his face twisted in confusion. It was a printout of the financial documents Lena had sent to the FBI, documents that detailed his embezzlement of charity funds. But what caught his attention the most was the final line, written in bold red ink: "This information has been forwarded to the authorities." His heart stopped for a moment as the reality of the situation began to set in. His mind raced. How could this have happened? He had been so careful, so meticulous in covering his tracks. But there it was, in black and white, a damning paper trail that could bring him to his knees. Victor quickly stood up from his chair, his face flushed with anger. "Who did this?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Who the hell would betray me like this?" Carla hesitated for a moment before speaking, her voice barely a whisper. "It's Lena. She's the one who exposed you." Victor's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. He couldn't believe it. Lena, the loyal employee who had always admired him, had turned on him. It didn't make sense. She had always seemed so trustworthy, so dedicated to the cause. But now, it was clear that she had seen through his facade. A dark smile spread across Victor's face. This was a problem, yes, but it was also an opportunity. If Lena had gone this far to expose him, he would have to deal with her swiftly. He couldn't allow this betrayal to go unchecked, not when so much was at stake. But at the same time, he knew that Lena's actions would ultimately be her undoing. Victor picked up the phone, dialing a number he knew by heart. "Get in here," he said, his voice cold and calculating. "We have a problem." The FBI's raid on Victor Mallory's office was swift and efficient. The agents moved in, fully prepared for what was to come. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the hallway as they made their way to his office, their mission clear: arrest Victor Mallory for embezzlement and a host of other crimes. The door to his office burst open, and FBI agents flooded the room, guns drawn. Victor's eyes widened as he saw them enter, the once confident CEO now a man caught completely off guard. He had no time to react before the agents were on him, pushing him against the wall. "Victor Mallory, you're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and money laundering," one of the agents announced, his voice firm. "You have the right to remain silent." Victor struggled for a moment, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the situation. His wealth, his power, all of it had been built on lies, and now it was slipping through his fingers like sand. He had been so close to escaping, so close to securing his future without anyone ever finding out the truth. But now, as the cold steel of handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Victor realized that his empire was crumbling. Lena had done what he thought was impossible. She had brought him down. The hum of the office, once filled with Victor's calculated charm and power, now felt eerily quiet. The agents' heavy boots echoed through the hallways as they led Victor toward the door. His mind raced, but the words of the arrest were like a distant echo. He couldn't grasp the magnitude of what was happening. For years, he had manipulated the system, believed he was untouchable, but in this moment, the reality of his downfall hit him like a ton of bricks. As the agents escorted him down the hallway, Victor's gaze fell on the shocked expressions of his employees, who had gathered at the office doors to witness the arrest. Carla stood there, her face pale, and though she had betrayed him in the past, he could see the regret in her eyes. He had built this empire, and now it was all unraveling because of a single, small crack. "Get me out of here," Victor muttered under his breath, frustration boiling inside him. He wanted to lash out, to regain control of the situation, but there was nothing he could do. He had underestimated Lena. He had underestimated how far she was willing to go to expose the truth. As the agents pushed him through the front doors of the building, the flashing lights of squad cars illuminated the darkening street. The news crews were already gathering, their cameras trained on the spectacle of his arrest. The whispers and gasps from the bystanders only added to the weight pressing down on his chest. Victor was led to a waiting FBI vehicle, where the agent who had first read him his rights now guided him into the back seat. As the door slammed shut, Victor finally spoke, his voice filled with bitterness. "You think this is it? You think I'm the only one?" he sneered. "You have no idea how deep this goes." The agent simply looked at him, his expression unchanging. "Save it for the court," he said coldly, closing the door and signaling to the driver. In the back of the vehicle, Victor's thoughts were a blur. He had been untouchable. How could everything have crumbled so quickly? The billions in charity funds he had stolen were his ticket to an unimaginable lifestyle. He had planned every move carefully, thinking he had covered every angle. But it had all come crashing down in a single night. Meanwhile, Lena watched from a distance as the car carrying Victor disappeared into the night. She couldn't quite believe what had just happened. It felt surreal. The weight that had hung over her for so long seemed to lift as the tension in her body eased. She had done the right thing, but part of her still struggled with the consequences of her actions. In the days that followed, the media was ablaze with the news of Victor Mallory's arrest. Headlines screamed the details of his crimes: embezzlement, money laundering, fraud, everything he had done under the guise of charity. News outlets played footage of his arrest on a loop, showing the once powerful CEO in handcuffs, a far cry from the charismatic philanthropist he had once appeared to be. His fall from grace was swift and dramatic, and it was the story of the year. Lena found herself thrust into the spotlight as reporters and journalists sought out her story. She had become a hero in the eyes of many, someone who had stood up against a powerful man for the sake of justice. But despite the accolades, Lena couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The truth had been exposed, but it came at a high price. She had already received several calls from the board of directors at Hope for Tomorrow, praising her for her courage. They assured her that everything would be fine, that she had done the right thing, but Lena couldn't help but wonder about the future of the charity. Would it recover from this scandal? Would the donors return, or would they turn their backs on the organization forever? Lena had always believed in the mission of Hope for Tomorrow, and now, more than ever, she realized how much work there was left to do. The charity had been tarnished by the actions of a man who had used its name for his own gain, but the work of helping the poor could still continue. It would take time, but Lena was determined to see it through. Days turned into weeks, and the dust slowly began to settle. Victor Mallory's trial was set to begin, and Lena prepared herself for the courtroom. She had agreed to testify against him, to share the evidence she had uncovered, and to make sure that the truth came to light in front of a jury. The courtroom was packed with reporters, journalists, and spectators, all eager to see the man who had once been a symbol of success brought to justice. As Lena took the stand, she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had never imagined she would be in this position, but here she was, fighting for what was right. The prosecutor called her to the stand, and as she stepped up, she glanced at Victor, who was sitting on the opposite side of the room, his face a mask of anger and bitterness. He was still a formidable presence, even in the face of his inevitable defeat. "Ms. Anderson," the prosecutor began, "could you tell the court what you discovered regarding Victor Mallory's financial activities at Hope for Tomorrow?" Lena took a deep breath before speaking, her voice steady and clear. "I discovered several discrepancies in the charity's accounts. I found evidence of large sums of money being diverted to personal offshore accounts, money that was meant to support the poor. Victor Mallory, the CEO, was embezzling funds that were meant for charity, using the organization's name to build his own wealth." As Lena spoke, she could see the shock on the faces of the jury. The evidence was undeniable. The prosecution presented her documents, the very same ones that had brought Victor down, and as the trial continued, it became clear that the truth was finally coming to light. In the end, Victor Mallory was convicted on all charges. His empire of lies, greed, and corruption had crumbled, and he was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. As the courtroom erupted in applause, Lena sat quietly, a sense of justice washing over her.